Horror fatigue. Is it even a thing, or is it just something that's destined to keep coming up every time horror has an unbelievably busy year? Let's talk about it. Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School, and a happy Friday to you. I want to preface this by saying that I hope everybody is doing as well as they can be. I hope that you are taking care of yourself, and yeah, I just hope that everything is going well for you. But let's get on to today's video. Today's video is about horror fatigue. It is a topic that has been coming up lately in light of all the horror that has been coming out, but it is a topic that has been coming up pretty much since horror has become a thing. So we're going to discuss horror fatigue, what it is, why it might not even be a thing, and what makes horror indestructible. What I'm curious about is if you've heard of this term before and if you have ever experienced it, or if you just love horror no matter what. Let me know in the comments below. Here we go. First, let's talk a little bit just about the history of horror, or the history of horror resilience, I should say. Horror is a genre that has been here forever. It feels like it has survived backlash. It has gone through its ups and downs, and it's had to change with the trends and the times. If anyone remembers the 1980s, if you weren't born yet, you definitely won't remember the 1980s. But for those of you that remember the 1980s or know about the 1980s, that was an era where horror exploded onto the screen due to the advent of the VCR and then VHS and then video stores, to where horror was made easily accessible. But the 1980s seemed like there was a new horror movie coming out almost every week. There were particularly a lot of slasher films. And you would think that with all of this horror and with all this direct to video horror coming out, that audiences, specifically horror audiences, would get sick of, oh God, another horror movie. Oh no, another Jason, another Michael, another Freddy movie. Oh dear God. But no, horror did not disappear into the ether, even though there was a ton of horror and slasher movies coming at that time. It just evolved in a new direction. Think of the evolution of the word thriller and how it replaced the term horror in the 90s. Horror evolved into a lot of psychological, edge of your seat horror. There was some supernatural stuff going on, and then horror took another turn in evolution with the meta slasher films, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and then later on Scream, which came out in 1996. So horror adapts, horror thrives on reinvention. No matter how much the critics are like, oh, this is too much horror, it needs to quit, it needs to stop. Horror audiences are just like, nope, just keep it coming. Give, give, give us whatever you can throw at us. We continue to see this adaptation and reinvention even go into the early 2000s with a renaissance in horror that was a direct response to the politics and the world events of the time. So you also saw the beginnings of franchises start, such like Saw and Hostel, and all the sequels that followed them up into the early 2000s and the mid 2000s. It didn't hurt either of those franchises any. What makes horror work even when it's seemingly everywhere? One word: versatility. Horror is one of the broadest and biggest genres out there. Horror is a big house with many rooms. And when you open the doors to those rooms, you can find subgenres like slashers, psychological, monster creature features, extreme horror, body horror, supernatural horror. The number of rooms that you could open to find what horror movie or horror subgenre that you like are endless. All these subgenres of horror offer different experiences and tap into different kinds of fears and what a person is the most afraid of. And it offers choices. For instance, if someone likes jump scares, but there's a lot of horror out there that has jump scares and someone gets tired of it, then they can switch gears and go to another type of horror film. This diversity and this choice of horror is exactly what keeps the genre alive. And horror is pretty reasonable to make as far as budget wise. Now, I'm definitely not saying that, just because a horror film has a small budget, that means that it's immediately going to be trash. Not the case. Horror movies, because they tend to have small budgets, rack up massive profits. Think of horror films like Paranormal Activity, for instance. This is a bit of what is called a low risk, high reward. There's not a lot of budget put into these horror films, but the return on them can be huge. This encourages more production, which leads to more releases, which means, too, there is always something fresh and new hitting the big screen or streaming services, if we're talking nowadays. Another thing I want to bring up is the balance of franchises versus original content. There was an article that came out in Vulture that was titled "Horror Movies Are Trying to Survive," and in it, Jason Blum, the head of Blumhouse Productions, said something along the lines that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that it's easier to sell a sequel or to get people to come to see a sequel than it is for them to come see an original horror movie, I should clarify. And it's true that sequels and even franchises already have that loyal following, already have that built-in fan base, will most likely guaranteed make a huge profit. But, and this is the big but, even franchises had to start somewhere, and even sequels had to start somewhere. A Nightmare on Elm Street was an original once. I don't think they had any plans to make a franchise out of it, at least not immediately. Same as with Friday the 13th, it was just a movie that they made to keep the lights on and pay the bills. They had no idea it would become the phenomenon and the franchise that it became, but it did. So it is a cycle. An original horror movie, like say for instance, Jordan Peele's Get Out, it captures attention and it sets a new set of standards, which then inspires more horror movies that come after it. And sometimes, depending on the movie, even sequels. And some industry experts, they might want to point the blame at the fact that people and horror audiences keep wanting original movies and they're harder to make and they're harder to sell. It's easy to blame that as the problem. And some industry experts may even point like, oh, just all this horror that's coming out, people are going to get sick of it. That is a huge problem. But just think about it. Saw, which started in 2004, is getting an 11th entry in the franchise. 11. And even some more recent examples like The Black Phone is getting a sequel. The Smile recently got a sequel. Audiences love horror. They're wanting horror. They crave horror. They're like, give me more horror. I don't think horror fatigue is really a thing, no matter the outcry of people in the industry going, oh no, people are going to get sick of horror. Nope, I don't think horror fatigue is a thing. Sure, whenever there's a lot of horror movies that come out, audiences may be pickier and pick and choose what they want to go see. But horror's adaptability, its multitude of subgenres, means it's far from worn out. Horror has proven time and time again that it's not confined to one phase, it's not confined to one trend. It is constantly growing and moving on and adapting. Horror is not only surviving, it is also thriving. As long as people love horror, and as long as people love getting scared, and as long as people try and use horror as a catharsis for their fears, horror is just going to keep coming out and it will always be there. Thank you so very much for watching this video. I would love to know your thoughts about horror fatigue and all this. What do you think about the term horror fatigue, or just your thoughts on horror fatigue in general? Let me know in the comments below. Give this video a like, a thumbs up, and share it with fellow horror fans. It really does help. And hit subscribe and the bell so that way you never miss a retro horror school class. I'm going to toss up a few more videos here I think you might like. And sadly, class is dismissed, everybody, for now, but I will see you next time. Bye.